Welcome to the Balance Sheet, where you can rise above the noise and learn about the most important business issues of our age. I'm your host and fellow student, Conrad Chua. The last few episodes have looked at different aspects of sustainability, whether in industries like electric vehicles or the financial side with ESG measurement, and also how startups can help tackle climate change. Today, we're going to go back up to the 30,000 feet level and ask, how can a region like Europe make an orderly transition to a clean energy future? McKinsey put together a report on this, and today we have first Tomasso Cavina and also Andre Ancelto, who co-authored the report. And if you want to read a report after this episode, I'll leave a link in the show notes. And you can also just click on the zap on the QR code in the upper right-hand corner. We also have Professor David Reiner, faculty here at CJBS and member of the Energy Policy Research Group. So first, welcome Tomasso, Andre, and David.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you.
So, Tomasso, do you want to start by telling us, I know you're going to talk a lot about later on how Europe has to balance three very difficult objectives, but do you want to start by saying, how did we get to this trilemma?
Yes, indeed. I think the underlining motivation why we came up with this piece of research, I think now the pathway on let's say what needs to happen in order to get to our minus 55% emission reduction is pretty clear. What we really asked ourselves is now what are the key unlocks in order to get there, and to get there not only at the pace that is required to get to those goals by 2030, but also to do it in an orderly fashion. And orderly fashion, we will talk about this later on, but substantially it includes getting there at the lowest possible cost in an affordable way, and also ensuring the security of supply, which has been hindered in the recent events during the energy crisis. I'll pass it over to my colleague Andre to give an... It's working.
Sure.
Perfect.
So let me perhaps start kind of where we are in the context, right? Because we are seeing on one hand that the world is facing these unprecedented challenges, right? So we are getting the warmest years, we're getting record high emissions, sea levels are dropping in terms of ice and rising in terms of water levels, and more there are risks around it. And when we look at the frequency of, let's say, extreme weather events, which is kind of a proxy of how this is affecting us, more and more we have significant number of 1 billion plus natural disasters, for example, in the US, with insurance rates going higher and also increasing the premiums. And kind of when we look over the last 100 or 150 years, we actually see that energy has been core to the development, right? To the growth and to the growth as society and growth as economically speaking, of how we develop ourselves and continue to do more and more with the resources that we have. And if you go to the next page and the next one, sorry, we see that we'll need a massive build out of green energy going forward. We're talking about 30 terawatts, roughly kind of 7 times today what we have installed, and a lot of investment. We're talking on the largest capital deployment and reallocation that we've seen since the last 100 years, probably. And however, we're doing this in a period of high volatility. If we go to the next page, We see that we're living in a world where prices go up and down. We're living in a world that is being affected by geopolitics. It's affected by things like COVID. That is throwing away kind of some certainty that we have, or some security that we had before, on the decisions that we do, on the investment decisions, on the personal decisions that we do. And when we see that, for example, with some of the announcements that we see on the media on the next page. Now, when we try to kind of summarize what we need and kind of how we structure, there are three things, and we're also talking on the next page. The energy trilemma revolves around this. On one hand, we want to reduce carbon emissions in line with the decarbonization objectives. A second one, which actually gained a lot of importance over the last 24 months, we see energy security as a critical point to ensure that we keep developing ourselves and that we keep growing. And a third one around affordability, right? So we need to do this on a path that makes sense economically, and that makes sense on attracting these large investments that we need. To give it a bit of color around these three, on the next page, for example, we're talking about changing completely how we supply power today, increasing the penetration of renewables, scaling the deployment of solar and wind onshore and offshore across the globe, shutting down and creating impacts on the communities, for example, on where coal is being installed, and scaling a completely yet evolving technology, which is the green H2. H2 today is already quite, let's say, a mature one. But when we're talking about green H2, we're still not there yet. And we already have huge ambitions set towards the end of the decade. This is on the supply side. On the demand side, we also see a major shift, right? Still in the previous page. We still see a major shift. On one hand, increasing demand from electrification that we're seeing more and more on things like EVs, as mentioned in the beginning, but also in the industry, right? So with the gas prices that we saw last year, we saw a lot of companies justifying and having a business case on electrifying some of the process, or investing in energy efficiency processes that would allow them to be spending much less on the energy, given the spike that they saw with the price increase. So we have shifts on supply and shifts on demand, and this is kind of where we're going with decarbonization. When we look at the security of supply, not only we have the situation on how dependent are we on, and this on the next page, how dependent are we on one source, like Russia we saw with the gas, but also on the type of challenges that this creates on the what we call firm capacity, right? So more and more renewables we have, less firm capacity we'll have. And this firm capacity will be critical if we want to have, let's say, a stable power system that doesn't have blackouts and doesn't, let's say, destroys a bit the system, given the intermittency that we're seeing more and more renewables. So more firm capacity will be needed. And on affordability, on the next page, we've done a bit of the math, and we believe that if we do electrification and if we do this transition properly, at the end of the curve, we will see a more efficient and more price affordable energy system. While, for example, if we continue on a prolonged crisis with geopolitics, this might create even an increased hurdle. But in the context, for example, of the EU, the EU doesn't have, let's say, the same natural resources as other countries or other geographies. And more, it's almost like a security needs to really develop these new ways of energy that are leveraging the natural resources that we have in the region. So all in all, to say on the next page that although we need an orderly energy transition, what we see is currently a disorderly energy transition. On decarbonization, for example, with increased prices on gas, a move to coal, given that, let's say, what was less constrained. The fact that inflation hit across society, we also saw that increase on res costas, and also driven by supply chain disruptions on raw materials and production capacity. On energy security, the fact that we saw a lot of reduction on gas imports from Russia, or the fact that, for example, France had some situation and some challenges with their nuclear fleet that kind of reduced the firm capacity available. And at the same time, on affordability, we see this volatility also hurting consumers at the end of the day and creating, for example, in some situations, an increase in energy poverty, which is not the path that we want to go to. So perhaps back to Tomasso on how are we seeing some of the unlocks around this disorderly energy transition that we want to make more orderly.
Thank you, Andre. Indeed. So let me comment. We see 6 main areas that needs to be tackled, and we'll give some insights on where the challenges really are. First, it's about scaling our local supply chains for clean technology. Second, the infrastructure that needs to support renewable integrations needs to be strengthened, and we expect investments to increase exponentially compared to the recent past. Third, land needs to be secured for renewable developments, and we know that currently there are pretty significant constraints on land that can be devoted to renewables in particular. And I think strictly connected with this, the fourth area, it's on permitting. Getting permitting both for renewable technologies such as utility scale solar or wind, and also grid infrastructure can take from 2 to 6 years, depending on the country. And of course, this is a massive bottleneck to get the technology on the ground that is needed by 2030. An evolving market design, the current one was built in a system which was based on centralized resources, based on, let's say, with the high fuel cost. Renewables are fixed costs, so the system needs to evolve. And the Commission has indeed introduced recently a reform package for the market design for Europe. And finally, on downstream technology is introducing the regulatory measures in order to foster the at-scale adoption of the technologies and, for example, address the high upfront costs that are needed in the near term for some of these.
Maybe, David, at this point, do you have any other sort of any views, reactions to this? Any other unlocks that you think we need to consider?
I mean, I think I agree with many of these points. I mean, they are critical, but it also explains why it's been so difficult, why it's been disorderly. And I guess my question or concern would be how to actually make these things more orderly. I mean, if we think about energy infrastructure, lots of countries have this problem where the place where you have the wind or offshore wind, places like that, are more remote and pretty far from the demand centers. And so that's true in the UK, where there's lots of wind up in Scotland and the demand's all down south. That's true in Germany. Similarly, where in Schleswig-Holstein, you'll have lots of wind, and the big challenge is that, it's been 20 years and we've known that we need to get the electricity from these more remote areas down to the demand centers, and the people in the middle don't want to see transmission lines. So I think that's an example of what will be one of the big challenges of unlocking the kind of a net zero transition. There's been kind of this consistent resistance to the type of large-scale energy infrastructure that's needed.
Indeed, I completely agree with you. Infrastructure is one of the main bottlenecks, and for example, we estimate that in order to exactly address some of the topics you've said, so increasing our interconnection capacity, investments, for example, in transmission will need to increase by almost 50% compared to what has been done in the recent years. Distribution, we estimate even from 50 to 70% with increased connections on renewables. This, of course, it's an incredible challenge, first for the network operators, but at the same time, it requires also, debottlenecking the permitting processes, and at the same time, having a more integrated planning across the different energy vectors. The system is more intertwined between power, gas, hydrogen. So indeed, very important topic.
If I may pile up, I think to David's point, I think we will always have kind of this challenge of actually convincing people that this is the right thing to do, and not always it's easy, especially when you're seeing some of these not in my backyard movements kind of perspectives. I think that's one challenge that we need to address with better communication, better what we call kind of stakeholder management at the end of the day. So don't leave these people unattended, and kind of have a proper involvement on the discussion. And I think on the other side is we believe that these things are going to happen one way or the other, because kind of that's where the countries have set their targets on. I think there is a timing issue. And this timing issue is also connected with how profitable and how feasible economically these projects are. Because in some situations, we're talking still, let's say, early stage technologies that are not there yet, and perhaps they need the proper push, either from VC investments or from incentives from things like the Green Deal in Europe, to actually push them forward, right? If you think, for example, on solar, today we have really cheap solar because China invested for many years on the technology, and today we have it at low prices. And that type of let's say change will be needed in some of these technologies and some of these investments, as you mentioned, on either infrastructure, connecting offshore, or even within lands. That will also be an important part of the discussion.
Thanks so much. And just a reminder, you can put your questions for the panel in the chat or comments of either YouTube or LinkedIn. Tomasso, you were going to talk about the supply on, let's say, clean manufacturing value chains.
Indeed, I think two important angles, and here we gathered some facts to stimulate the thinking. If we look at the clean technology that is needed to achieve the goals, across many of the core technologies, solar, wind, batteries, Europe's share of manufacturing is very limited. So, for example, if we take the solar value chain, more than 85% is imported through China. And of course, this can introduce some risks of spikes in prices, in availability, and timeliness of the technology that is needed. So we see some initial moves of operators that are starting to strengthen the local European, let's say, value chain. For example, Enel in Sicily is now building a gigafactory, a free gigafactory, which is one of the first at the European level. We also asked ourselves, okay, what would be the impact and the cost to strengthen the European local chains. This example is for solar. We believe that the cost to manufacture solar panels in Europe would be from 8 to 10% higher compared from importing through China, which applied to the level of volumes that will be needed by 2030 can translate into a significant cost for the overall system. So indeed, it's a very important topic and needs to be addressed, and is being addressed with the dedicated funding, which can and back to the energy triangle, which can make the transition affordable ultimately for the final customers. The second big point that needs to be addressed specifically on delivering the physical infrastructure is on labor. The demand in particular for blue and white collars, the example you see here is specific for renewable technologies, will be massive. And already today we see big constraints in the availability of labor that is needed both for renewable, but also for increasing grids investments. In this case, for example, we're speaking about 3 times in 2030 what is currently available today. And this will need a coordinated effort between regulators, governments, and operators to attract and build the talent pool that will be needed in order to reach to these levels. Of course, part of it could come from the reskilling and upskilling of jobs that will be lost due to the phase out of conventional generation. For example, old gas plants or coal that will be retired, but more will need to be say found by tapping in other value pools. I would go maybe to one additional point, which we think it's pretty relevant. If we go to the next page, please, Conrad. Another topic which I mentioned, which we believe it's very important to be addressed, is on land availability. We have made some simulations in order to understand how much land will be needed in order to get to 2030 goals. Here you find some examples for a couple of countries for both wind and solar. For example, if we take a country like Italy, getting to the 50 gigawatts, additional gigawatts that are needed by 2030, it will require to use 60% of the land that is technically available. Of course, this number is huge, and it's driven by the fact that there are limits on the kind of land that can be used. So the conversation the topic is of course pretty complicated. There are competing land usages that needs to be taken into account, but the implications are for sure that land is currently scarce, and the governments and the local stakeholders need to address the current constraints and limitations, for example, in distance between plants and settlements, right?
Tomasso, it sounds like basically you were having to use tremendous amounts of land just to generate power, generate energy. Where are we going to find all this?
That's exactly
you can't grow the land.
That's a very good question. The point is, if we take, for example, example of Italy, and then Andre is from Iberia, so I guess he can comment as well. Now, for example, agricultural land cannot be deployed to build renewables that can participate to government auctions. So the land is there, It's technically available. However, due to regulatory constraints, it cannot be used. And this is one example. At the same time, there is a big potential also from exploiting existing rooftops. In the short term, and I will comment in a while while looking at permitting, for sure, using available rooftop areas could be one way to address it, especially for solar, of course.
Yeah, but if I may follow up, Conrad, I think this page shows a problem that we have, which is the technical availability lens, right? If you think on the overall lens, there is, when you look at the numbers, we're talking about 1 to 3% of the land in a given country. So if you think about it, for example, I heard this the other day, like the amount of space occupied by golf courses in the UK would be enough to supply the entire solar panels that you would need for the UK to do the development. Just as an example, I think the issue that we have is, one, not always, and to David's point, not always the land is in the places that you need, because either you don't have the connections there or you don't have the grid infrastructure there, and as such, even though the land might be good, then you don't have the conditions to do it. Or, for example, you have more and more kind of this NIMBY effect that limits some of the land that would be available for this. So land is a challenge, yes, but if you put on the big scheme of things, we're talking about really a small percentage of land. And especially, for example, if you go to regions like Iberia, we actually have a lot of land. And there is this whole notion that eventually you need to be better connected across countries to actually leverage the best resources on the offshore in Scotland and the offshore in the Nordics and the sun in Spain and Italy, for example. The more and more you do this, the more and more you will be able to kind of leverage the best resources on each of the geographies.
David, what are your views on this? Like, how do you see the UK and other European countries tackle land use?
Well, again, I think the largest single subsidy program in the EU is with regard to agricultural subsidies, and I think that's clearly an area that will need reform. Because I think, and we're already starting to hear some of these discussions with regard to removals. So the negative side of the equation. But it seems to me this could very much fit into that discussion. There's lots of land that's being farmed because of the subsidy regimes, and if we really wanted to mobilize more land, I think that's, I don't know, it's easily soluble, but we, unlike some of these other dimensions like the jobs equation and retraining coal miners, I think that's a lot more challenging. Getting transmission lines more challenging, as I think Andre was saying. There's lots of places like in Spain and Poland and so on where there would be kind of land available that you just need a subsidy regime, and farmers and other landowners are used to responding to those type of changes in subsidy regime that would allow them, I think, to switch over fairly readily.
Spoken like a true economist, David. We have a question from Pooja who asks about this slide here. So Pooja asks, why do you feel that technicians are going to be the major pain point when it comes to labor?
Thanks for the question. Yes, look, so we estimated the kind of profiles that are typically required to develop both renewable capacity and grids. And simply by looking at the jobs that are needed and translating this into the future additions that we expect will be required by 2030, the number simply explodes and multiplies, as you see. And already today, with the massive increase of infrastructural investments, not only on the energy side, but on rail infrastructure, on telecommunications, the kinds of profiles such as electricians or construction workers are already today scarce. And if you typically, I mean, when we speak with our clients and we ask them what are the bottlenecks in order to scale these technologies, this is typically mentioned already today as one of the most let's say burning challenges to address.
Yeah, and I can speak as a governor of a further education college here in the UK. We are trying to expand getting a lot more students into things like solar, become technicians, etc. And the bottleneck is we can't find people to train them because they're all having attracted by high salaries to go and work on projects. So it is going to be quite difficult, and of course it's a long lead time to train somebody in some of these areas. So Tomasso, I think on this thing about bottlenecks, the other part is that you've identified is these long lead times for maybe permit approval.
Indeed, that's one of the other very relevant areas. Of course, these points are being touched upon by different pieces of regulation. But if we look at the picture today, we see that on average, the permitting times between the project start and when the permits are actually permitted, including grid connection, takes a lot of years. Of course, it's more complicated for onshore wind technologies than solar, and there are, of course, best practices across the different countries, but also within the countries at the level of the different areas or region. This is one of the areas that, in my personal opinion, needs to be addressed with most urgency. This is the reason why, for example, in a country like Italy, rooftop solar panels have had a much more accelerated deployment than utility scale renewable plants, which take a much longer time to grant the permits. And one of the
Sorry, I was going to ask David. What's the UK experience, since we are famously very slow in getting any major projects off the ground?
Yeah, the problem is actually not just major projects. It's actually at the more boring level of getting grid connections for, and at the moment there's kind of a vast pipeline of unmet kind of grid connections that are kind of waiting to get onto the grid. So I think that's going to be one of the big questions that pretty much every country in Europe faces with regard to. It's not so much that there isn't the projects; it's that both from a permitting point of view and just that kind of technical ability to connect up these projects in the pipeline is already proving to be a big challenge, and that probably will only grow in the future.
And I think one important point to mention is that in several cases, delays in permitting is also caused by opposition of the local communities. Seen a recent survey by which I think it was on Germany. It actually says that 70% of the people interviewed actually are in favor, of course, of renewables. However, almost 80% don't want them in their backyard. If you do ask the same question to those that actually have plants within their communities, however, the vast majority does not encounter any problems with those. So where I'm getting to is that communicating also the benefits and potentially passing over some of the benefits of these projects, like giving the possibility of having investments by the communities sharing the returns, is also a way to let's say address this issue.
Okay. And Tomasso, you were going to talk also about the design of the power market.
Yes, thank you, Conrad. Indeed, if we look at permitting, so in regulation in general, the other important side to look upon is on the market design rules. And as you might know, the European Commission has proposed an important proposal of reform for the European power market design. And as I was mentioning at the beginning, the current system is mostly based on spot markets, which were designed to, let's say, dispatch generation towards the lowest cost assets, being gas or coal, based on the commodity prices. Now we're going to a level where, to a world where the major generating technologies don't have marginal costs. It's all upfront investments. So we need long-term markets that can provide price stability to these new technologies. It's true for renewables. It holds the same for the flexible capacity that will be needed to integrate these renewables, such as batteries, pumped hydro, and so on. So as I was saying, this point is being addressed by this piece of regulation that is being discussed right now, and I would say one of the prides of the European scheme is really to have a common rules throughout the different countries, and one integrated energy market that can lower the overall cost of energy for all of the countries.
Yeah. And David, do you have any thoughts about this? Because I know you and the other colleagues in the Energy Policy Research Group have done a lot of work on the energy markets.
Sure. I mean, obviously, things like these kind of one-way CFDs, kind of badly implemented policies, are being reformed. I mean, I think this is recognition, as we saw it during the crisis, that if there are generators that are making massive rents, you want to make sure that there won't be that type of kind of taking of rents during these periods. I think some of the critical points that they get to here, which I think are important, is that if we have a system that's more and more based around variable renewables, we need, again, going back to incentivizing the flexibility that's needed to keep the system operating, right? So you need the batteries, you need the low carbon alternative generation, both short-term flexibility through batteries, but also longer term flexibility, things like maybe pumped hydro on the system. And again, it's not beyond the capacity of regulators to do this, but they do need to change, right? So the UK and Ireland have long been leaders in terms of flexibility and bringing, say, batteries onto the system. Europe, continental Europe, has kind of lagged behind in some of this, and there needs to be, again, further incentives to make these projects more viable, so that as we keep adding more variable renewables, we have the flexibility to keep that system operating. So it's kind of, this is a critical part. It's kind of, it's quite detailed, it's quite technical, but it's also critical that we have this is a different sort of capacity. It's not the electricians, it's the people in the regulatory agencies who have the ability to come up with a policy design that will kind of make the system fit for purpose for a net zero system.
Indeed, and to build upon your point on flexibility, for example, we see some first examples of let's say dedicated support mechanisms also beyond in continental Europe. For example, Italy is introducing right now the first long-term auctions for large-scale storage. Exactly following this logic, you need flexible capacity. Most of it is not in the money if you look only at spot markets, so you need dedicated long-term mechanisms to get the capacity you need on the ground.
And Tomasso, I think with all of what you've said, I guess the question is, how is everybody going to pay for all this?
I think, look, getting back to one of the first charts that Andre commented, if you get the sequencing correct, so you balance the speed at which the energy transition is happening, ultimately the message is that the cost of energy will go down. And this will be the effect of reduced demand from energy efficiency and electrification, the benefits of lower cost of power generation through renewables that typically have will have a lower cost compared to the conventional alternatives, especially now with these high prices that you're all aware about. So ultimately, there is a big opportunity to lower the cost and to reduce the reliance and the volatility. That's, I think, another very important point to stress. Now here, apologies for the very complicated and full of number charts, but if we look at one of the pieces, so on the downstream technologies and on the final users hat, we compared, this is an example just for Italy, but similar logic would apply also for other countries. We looked at three types of households. The traditional one that has a mix of electricity, natural gas for heating, and oil for transport. And we compared it with a fully electrified household. The messages is that if you consider the 2030 view, so factoring in the reduction in the cost of electric vehicles and of heat pumps that we expect, from economies of scale as the adoption increases, the electric family would spend less. Will spend less, reduce the overall emission. So if you see the traditional household would emit almost 4 tons of CO2 versus less than 1 of a fully electrified household, in a system that has a big share of renewables in the mix. So ultimately, if we get it right, there's a big opportunity. Of course, there are some let's say, barriers and constraints. As of now, the costs are still higher. So the pathway in cost decreases still needs to happen. And at the same time, converting to fully electric could require high upfront investments, which of course needs to be tackled accordingly. And these are some of the barriers, some of the most important barriers to actually get to the 2030 scenario.
Thanks, Tomasso. And we're almost out of time, but wanted to quickly ask our panel. So overall, are you optimistic that Europe, and I include the UK into this, would make an orderly energy transition? Maybe, David, we start with you. What are your thoughts? Quick ones.
Sure. I mean, it's sitting in 2023, we've gone through some of the most disruptive events in the history of European energy, right? We have COVID-19, we've had obviously the Russian invasion, but also these other bubbling tensions. On the one hand, Fridays for the Future, Greta Thunberg demanding more action, and on the other, the Gilets jaunes and efforts to kind of populist backlash against these kind of rising costs. So it's a very challenging time to be talking about orderly transition. I mean, my expectation is that this is still going to be quite messy for the next few years. The transition, in many ways, has a lot of momentum behind it in Europe, but I think there are lots of both at the European level and at the wider global geopolitical level that will be tensions that won't make this that smooth and that orderly.
Andre, your quick thoughts.
Yeah, I agree with David, and I think it will be a bumpy ride, but an exciting one at the same time, because I think we're seeing many innovations and things coming up. And if we look at the last 24 months, people think that we might decelerate it. In my perspective, we've actually accelerated the energy transition when we see countries like Germany putting more coal in the short term, but closing it sooner than in the long term. So there are some good signs, some challenging signs, a lot of work to do, and that's kind of exciting on the path ahead.
And Tomasso, you have the last word.
Thank you. I completely agree with what has been said. I think some reasons to be optimistic, though, are there. 2022 has been a record year in terms of renewable capacity deployments in Europe. Energy efficiency has and behavioral consumption has reduced the consumption both in power and in gas. So indeed, some positive signals together with major reforms that have been introduced this year make me probably a little bit more optimistic.
Oh, great. That's a good note to end. And thank you very much for giving us a good understanding of the magnitude of the challenge. Now, the balance sheet will continue next week. We will have Andre Lacroix, the CEO of Intertech, formerly also CEO of Eurodisney, talking about how to put people at the heart of your strategy. It'll be a different time than usual. It'll be Wednesday, 22nd November, 6:05 p.m. UK time. Till then, thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.